But without much further ado, I would like to introduce Vanessa Andreotti. So good morning to Canada, and thanks very much for joining us at this early time of the day. Vanessa holds the Canada Research Chair in Race, Inequalities and Global Change at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And as I already mentioned, she has extensively worked across sectors internationally, especially in areas of education related to global justice, international development education, community engagement, indigenous knowledges, and internationalization. And as already mentioned, she will share some of her work and some of her research. So the floor is yours, Vanessa.
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm so sorry I couldn't come last time. I was sick. So with the apologies on the table, I'm very happy to be here today and happy that you managed to reschedule it. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
You have received the text, right? The global justice text. What I would like to do today is actually to test with you a presentation that I'm having to put together. It's a draft presentation, and it is for a selection process here at my university that gives me the possibility to create a center for it's for global justice, although the term here doesn't work in the same way. So I'm having to change the term to global interdependence or to planetary interdependence in order to make it intelligible. So I will have to ask for your permission to be able to change a little bit the title and test with you the presentation and then get some feedback as well. If you work with post-colonial theory or decolonial theory or indigenous theory, you would know that it's extremely hard to translate these concepts into very accessible language. It's also hard to be talking to audiences when they already have a predefined idea of post-colonial theory or sometimes they have an allergy to it. So trying to actually get people to listen with an open heart to what you're trying to say is one of the difficulties of this work. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking to people who probably have never heard, as well as people who are very familiar with post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, and indigenous studies, and people who maybe don't like it. So I try to shift a little bit the way that I talk about it in order to try to speak to the heart. So if you can get me, if you can give me some feedback at the end, it would be great. So I'll just share the screen and see if we can get started. Like, where is it? Here, found it. So here you go. Can you all see it? Can you just confirm that you can see it?
Yes, can see it, okay.
Okay. So I chose the title as Interdisciplinary Studies in Global or Planetary Interdependence, and it may become a center for this if I'm successful. And the subtitle, which might not be this one at the end, at this time, is The Mobilization of Hope and Rage in times of instability. It could be also in times of unprecedented global challenges. I haven't decided yet. So I start by saying that I study global interdependence through an interdisciplinary lens, focusing on the mobilizations of hope and rage in times of instability. So my work is concerned with humanity's capacity and lack of capacity to figure out how to get out of a mess it has created, a mess that jeopardizes its own survival. So in my work, I study a number of intriguing puzzles. For example, why is it that we as human species are choosing to wreck the planet we depend upon for survival? Why do we choose more often than not the path that leads us to demean, to exploit, to enslave, to hurt, and to kill other species and each other? Why do we choose to build nations and empires on the broken backs of our relatives? Why is it that we deny these things and don't want to hear about it? Why is it that we only want to hear about things that make us feel good or hopeful? What ways of doing, knowing, wanting, and being lock us in this predicament? Is this a moral, intellectual, affective, relational, and or neurobiological issue? And my work is actually going at the moment more towards the neurobiological side of things to see how our intellectual and affective dimensions are all connected. And sometimes we believe that by changing things cognitively, we will change everything else, and that is not the case. So my main question in education is what educational processes have the potential to override our neurobiological wiring, our fears, our self-interest, our narratives, our ego, our narcissistic tendencies, our traumas, both collective and individual, that activates a visceral sense of entanglement, responsibility, humility, and generosity that is not dependent on will or intellectual choices. In this sense, I'm looking for what beyond convictions can offer an antidote to indifference. And I'm looking for an education that can open up possibilities in worlds that are viable, but unimaginable or inarticulable within our current frames of reference. So here, in terms of our capacity to wreck the planet that sustains us, I studied the house that modernity built. So this is a social cartography that is available actually, and I will show you at the end where the full text is at on the website. But it's a social cartography that places modernity / coloniality within a house. It's the metaphor of a house that exceeds the limits of the planet. In this house, changes, there are many modernities, but there is a primary structure that doesn't change in the many modernities we talk about. So the first thing about it is that there's separability between humans and nature, and that's the foundation of the house. Then there's the nation state as the protector of private property or collective property, but it's still property that it relates to, and borders. And there is universal reason on the other side, the idea of a single rationality, a single story, the idea that we relate to the world through meaning made, and that this meaning describes reality. And then there's a roof that today is the roof of global capital, which is different from the roof of the industrial capital. In this roof of global capital, we talk about in terms of it being structurally damaged and leaking. So the roof of global capital is causing a lot of problems because it's based on unsustainable growth, overconsumption, because of technology too. We're facing a context of a surplus labor force, a mental health crisis, there's economic and political instability, and a cancellation of welfare and rights happening across the board. So the house is cracking, and we have to start thinking about whether we want to fix it, to expand it, to build another house, to build other types of shelter, to live without the house. So the question here is, how do we face socioeconomic, political, and ecological crisis together? However, because we have lived inside this house for a long time and our securities are dependent on it, we have to be thinking about the ways of being, doing, wanting, and thinking or knowing that we have become over-socialized in within the house that may restrict the ways we respond to the instability. So in that sense, in terms of existing ways of doing, knowing, wanting, and being, I study what I call the Boxhead, which is another cartography that talks about the kinds of patterns of reasoning that we see within the house. It's not just reasoning that is important here, but patterns of desire, patterns of entitlements, patterns of fear are also important here. But today I'm going to concentrate on reasoning. So Boxhead is based on the maximum, I think, therefore I am, the Cartesian cogito, and it is this thinking of Boxhead is marked by dialectical, utility maximizing, logocentric, evolutionary, teleological, universalist, allochthonic, and anthropocentric thinking. So this means it's not just I think, therefore I am. Dialectical would mean that it's good, therefore it isn't bad. Utility maximizing, I benefit, therefore I'll do it, and so on. I say, therefore it is. For logocentric, I name it, therefore that's all there is. And I rock, therefore you suck. There is all of that within Boxhead. And Boxhead, if we have lived within the house, is within all of us. It's not something like that. It's over there. We've been socialized in it. And Boxhead is useful for certain things, but not for others. Like, for example, for building relationships, this guy is not so good. But maybe for building a plane, it may actually be one of the best things one of the best tools that we have. The problem is that when it becomes the only tool that we have and we want to relate to the world through Boxhead, which means putting the world into a box. The world doesn't fit into a box. So if we do that, we will have several difficulties in dealing with the complexities and paradoxes and indeterminacy of the world. And we will be afraid of this indeterminacy, which may be something related then to how we mobilize hope for continuity and how we mobilize rage in these times. We can get there if you want to during the questions time. And in terms of opening up possibilities for different horizons of hope too, I'm interested in initiatives setting horizons of hope beyond reform, the reform of modernity, possibilities that gesture beyond the house of modernity. So here you have another cartography that is part of another article that talks about the soft reform of modernity, which means making modernity better just by changing policies and changing behaviors, but based still on a single story of progress, development, and human evolution. Then there is an acknowledgement between soft reform and radical reform. There's an acknowledgement, a recognition that there is epistemological dominance within modernity. So there's this attempt to open up perspective. So radical reform is about a unification of the direction, but with multiple perspectives, multiple contributions, the participation and inclusion of more people. And then there also between radical reform and beyond reform, a recognition that there's ontological dominance of a way of being, even in radical reform. So beyond reform is about disinvestment in the current unsustainable world and walking with others into the possibility of new worlds. So here it's about hospicing or hacking or coming up with alternatives to a world that is dying and figuring out ways of assisting with the birth of something new, undefined and undefinable a priori, like you can't predetermine it from the outset, but that can be potentially, but not necessarily wiser. So here you have very different questions and different answers. And I have a funded project in Canada to look for case studies of communities that have been working in the beyond reform realm, and not only just saying, oh, this is the answer. It's not the answer, but it's looking at what challenges they face, what paradoxes they face in trying to create a different world. So I'm working on that as well. And I'm also experimenting myself with a collective of artists calling gesturing towards decolonial futures in a network of socio-ecological communities called Inner Scare. So we have a network that has a framework, and it's both a framework and a network. And Earth Scare means ecological for Earth, then cognitive, affective, relational, and economic justice. And we use the metaphor of mycelium to talk about the fact that ecological and economic justice are mushrooms of mycelium, of cognitive justice, affective justice, and relational justice. So if we don't have healthy mycelium underneath the ground, we won't have mushroom. And in modern societies, we tend to focus on building ecological and economic justice without looking at what's sustaining this economic and ecological justice, which in this metaphor would be cognitive justice, which means an encounter, and here I'm using the work of Boaventura de Souza Santos, an encounter of knowledges and ignorances, this idea of ecology of knowledges beyond abyssal thinking. Then there's also a changing of our relationship with what we know, what we don't know, and what is unknowable. This realm of unknowability is very important in this work because like from indigenous studies, it's through unknowability that we relate to each other, not through identity, understanding, or knowing, right? So how do we relate? How do we find security also in the unknowable? That's one of the questions there. Then there's effective justice, which means that we need to deal with a big emotional constipation that we have and allow it to be digested and to pass. So basically to deal with our shit, and both individual and collective, and understand that shit is also fertilizer. It needs to go back to the soil. It needs to be able to be decomposed and to give life again. And we have a serious difficulty in dealing with that at the moment because of a history of Boxhead. Boxhead is not very good at dealing with that. And then there's relational justice, which is this antidote to indifference, where we see ourselves as part of a wider metabolism that includes the land, includes the planet, includes everything that lives in the planet. And we don't see ourselves just in this bodily temporality. We see ourselves as our existence actually spanning much more than one life in one body. We see ourselves connected with everything and entangled with everything, and therefore responsibility towards these other things and towards future generations is not a matter of intellectual choice, is what we feel viscerally in relation to the world. So I'm looking at this as the conditions for a different type of ecological and economic justice to emerge as the mushrooms, right? This would be just a result of us sorting out our shit, understanding how better, or relating better to both our knowledges and ignorances, and bringing everything together, and figuring out that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves. So you will find, this is more or less what the presentation is about, but there's still a little bit more that I need to say where to find stuff if you're interested. So there's a Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective, which is the artistic collective, where you will find a lot of this more, the cartographic material, the pedagogical material. You will find it there. And it's like an incubator for different ideas that we're still working with. So nothing that is there is supposed to be a normativity for people to just take and say, this is the new thing that, it's about experiments, basically. Then there's the Inner Care Network and Framework, which can be found on a UBC blog. Then there is the House and Mycelium, a metaphor that I told you about. There's also there the cartography, the soft radical beyond map, and there is also a course called Just See Otherwise that is a pilot course that we're doing for teachers in the UK that has some videos if you want to explore more. And I'm just going to leave you here with some of the authors that have informed the work that I presented today, and I think that's it. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I think I'm just going to stop sharing here. Right? Yep, that's it.
Thanks very much. And I really love that you've got so much illustrations and so much visualizations of the and because, as you say, post-colonial, decolonial arguments and discussions are oftentimes really abstract and really intellectual, rather than what does it have to do with real life, rather than being just an intellectual exercise or activity. So thanks so much. And I would like to now open the floor to everyone. So please think of put your questions to Vanessa. Either you put them in the chat box, or just let me know in the chat box whether you want to ask something, and then just unmute yourself. there is one already, which is asking, you gave the example of socio-ecological community. Or can you explain that a little bit further, a little bit more detail, or give an example of such community?
Yeah, there are two things here, I think, if you're looking for examples. So this Earth Care network emerged out of another network called Ecoversities. And the Ecoversities network has just had their meeting in India. It's chaired by Manish Jain, Kelly Temi, and Udi Mendel. So they collect, it's a network, a wider network of socio-ecological initiatives. And if you are interested, they have a website, and they do talk a lot about possibilities and alternatives. But from this network, I was looking for those projects that had a decolonial approach, because there you have everything. And sometimes we look at, for example, permaculture as a decolonial approach, and it can be, but oftentimes it reproduces the same way of being that decolonial theory criticizes, right? So you have, for example, lots of permaculture projects in Mexico that never ever relate to the indigenous communities territories where they're putting their project on. So sometimes you just address one form of justice, but you don't relate differently. So I went to the network, I'm part of that network, and I was looking for projects that would set horizons of hope beyond at least 3 or 4 things. So beyond socialism, capitalism, and anarchism, beyond a single story of human progress, development, and human evolution. And here I'm thinking about not just like the thing about, okay, there's a Western single story, but there are also other single stories. And what I was looking for were people who were looking at opening it up rather than having a single one. Then it's beyond anthropocentric separability, so not seeing ourselves as the center of the world, seeing everything as interconnected and entangled. And the last thing, I can't remember now. Anyway, I think it's beyond the nation state. So they were thinking about the future, not with the borders that we are seeing right now. And I found a number of them, I didn't find any one of them that met the 4. So they made me 3. One of them that I like to talk about is Chiran. It's a community in Mexico that managed to get the cartels out, get the government out, and and establish their own system of governance based on indigenous principles. It's their story is online, so I'm not going to recount here, but it's a very, very inspiring example. There's also the Shish Kantar Institute in India, and all of this is problematic. None of this can be seen as, okay, this is the model. I don't think they give us even, the only thing they can give us, I think, these examples is the idea that it's possible to imagine differently, right? So they're very inspiring, but don't go there to find a model that replaces modernity, because they're showing how we can swim, basically, right? So in a situation of a flood, when the water is going up, it's only when the water is at the waistline that we can actually swim. So these people are the swimmers. They've tried something, they know a swimming technique, and they can tell us that we can survive this. But they are not going to be able to tell us how to swim in our own flood, in our own current. We will have to learn how to do that ourselves. So it's not a model, but it's an example that we want to bring forward. So if you go to the website, there are other examples there. But it's very important to remember these are not models. They are examples, and they're examples that are pedagogical to inspire rather than to follow. Sorry.
Well, I actually think that's in general the problem we have, that we are always kind of searching for the holy grail, the once all fits all types of solution, and that's why, especially in development theory, you know, there's been this shift and this trend from there to there, but always on the hunt for this great solution.
Yeah, and if we don't change that thinking, and that it's a desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of wanting. Mm-hmm. we will miss so much that we can learn, both from our own mistakes and from other people's mistakes too, and inspiring things that have happened around us. And I don't think it's taking us where it needs to be. And that was one of the reasons why in the ecoversities, I found it problematic that what most people wanted to do there was just to celebrate their success and not talk about the difficulties.
Well, that's a human feature in general. Huh? You never want to talk about your films.
There's a very good article about it by Udi Mandel and Kelly Tammy about alternatives, and I would definitely recommend it. But you will see in the article that is a celebratory narrative. It's a narrative that wants to give people hope. Mm-hmm. But yes, and mm-hmm. we also need to be educating our hope in a different way, right? Mm-hmm. We need hope beyond hope. We need a hope that is that has the stamina to deal with the difficulties, to deal with the paradoxes, the complexities, the challenges, and to deal with failure. And if we don't develop that, what happens is that people start these initiatives and then they burn out because it doesn't go according to what they have projected, what they have desired, right? So if we don't change the heart to say that actually it's our failure right now that is going to give us the seeds that other generations are going to be able to use to create wiser alternatives, we will always going to be looking for the dopamine of getting something done. But this dopamine is another addiction, right? Or we're going to be looking for a community, which is oxytocin, a community and an echo chamber kind of thing. And it's not. That's why I'm going more towards the neurobiological now and saying, okay, what exactly are we addicted to, right? Mm-hmm. When we want these different things, and what is it that we're lacking? And my hunch is that this is just metaphorical, that modernity creates a serotogenic deficiency. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that is responsible for our sense of intrinsic worth. So that basement of the house of modernity that separates us from everything else, it also separates us from the intrinsic worth of life. So it's taken away, and then you were told that for you to have value, you have to produce value in society. Right? So everything to have value in society has to be producing some value. Even nature, it has a value as a resource, right? So that primary separation creates in us the feeling, or something that may not be producing enough of this intrinsic value that we have, and creates an insecurity. And from that insecurity, we start buying into what modernity offers, right? Mm-hmm. Which is dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins, right? All different. So in that sense, modernity would be a drug pusher. Like, you buy this once, I take in order to replace the deficiency that I've created. By separating you from the land, separating you from the cosmos, separating you from this visceral sense of entanglement and interdependence that we have with everything else. And we still produce serotonin, of course, but the problem is not necessarily the production. The problem is the sourcing of it, what we associate dopamine with, what we associate endorphin with, and how we keep on producing what modernity wants us to produce by just being neurobiologically attached to it. Mm-hmm. Well, these are all hypotheses, like they're not.
Well, I just want to go back to like a really, like practical concern, of a researcher, in a like university environment. You say, we need to obviously, as you just said, we can't go on reproducing the same way of being. We need this fundamental reform of ontology. And And then secondly, you emphasized, we can learn from each other. We can learn from our own mistakes. We can learn from others. And there's so many good practice examples there, and we just have to learn. But then on a really practical thing, well, firstly, obviously, these very good and very well practiced examples, they need to have a platform. They need to have space, to be heard and to be listened to, and to speak, basically. And then secondly, when I think of myself, as a researcher in a neoliberal university environment where I do actually have to produce, as you just say, it's the same logic of modernity. I have to produce knowledge. So how do you bring that together? Or I mean, you would know from of yourself being in the university context, but also being involved with activists and with collectives of like people working on alternatives. And then again, when we talk about modernity, this really Anglophone, Euro-American centered types of scholarship. So where basically, long question cut short, where as a researcher, how do you put your ideas out, and also the people you work with and you connect with, how do you give them space so that they are heard in these realms where they should be heard and considered?
So one thing, I think we'll start with that and say that, for example, for people in Shannon, they were not really interested in being heard at the university. They said it's not if you want to, you can, but then you have to just represent us in ways that are in ethical ways. They were concerned about that, but it was not their concern to have a platform in where, for us, they were more concerned with what was happening around them and within their region, for example. And then when I went there to work with them and with other communities in Mexico, what I generally do when I cross the border and into the other side, I say, okay, so this is the symbolic capital that I bring from the university. Use it. So tell me what to do. Tell me what in your fight, right? So that the reciprocity there, as I go and create these examples that I bring to this side, what I say is, this is what I bring here. How can I be useful? Use it, right? And they do, like in Mexico specifically, they say, they start to use me in their struggle. So that's one of the things that, so for example, there I have to say that I'm a Canadian researcher, because if I say that I'm a Brazilian researcher, it doesn't have the same level. So they book interviews where I go and then I ask them, what should I say? And they say, okay, say that you came here to learn about what we're doing and that Canadians are interested. Because if the locals hear that, both inside the community and around the community, they will become more interested, because they think if people from the outside come here to hear this, there's more value. So that's the kind of, like, it's a lot of translation between this context that you have to put yourself from one and go into another one. I would never say I'm a Canadian researcher here, but there I have to. And it doesn't matter, because if it's useful for them, I'll do that. I'll do what they want me to do. As long as it doesn't breach my integrity, but this doesn't. So that's one thing. So working with the communities means working with their priorities, right? And not trying to impose my priorities on them. So when I say I'm bringing the example, I have to bring the example with their permission, but also knowing that what I do with it might not be what is interesting for them. Then there is a second question about neoliberalism. It took me a long time to figure out how to do this in the neoliberal university. And I think I mourned a lot the neoliberal thing, but the liberal thing was also colonial. So it's not like I'm nostalgic for what was before, as my colleagues might be. And so it took me a long time to see that neoliberalism also offers space, and it is a constrained space, but for things like social innovation. It's concerned with its own continuity, so it will offer some space for us to talk about crisis. And I'm then had to translate myself into the concerns that would be intelligible in that context. But once I figured that out, how to do that, it became much easier. So the agenda for sustainability is a big one, but they understand sustainability as continuity. I understand sustainability as the sustainability of life, and it's fine. So the projects are about then sustainability. Social innovation is another one. The agenda of global citizenship works differently. In Europe, it works much better. You lead to global justice, again, I said, works in other places, doesn't work here. You have to be very strategic with language and how you put things forward and how you translate, so that you keep the complexity and you keep the integrity of the work at the same time that they see that you're also meeting some of the objectives that they have. And it's a fine line here about playing the game and being played by it. Yeah, and we know that, and there's the complicity. But what I see myself doing right now is trying to mobilize resources from the university towards also outside the communities, the initiatives that are trying to do something different. So there's also that. And at this point, it's okay. I'm not sure if in the future it's going to be the same like what it is right now. And I'm ready to leave when my integrity is no longer sustainable in this environment. But so far, like right now, it's okay.
Okay. I'm just seeing. I think we have Francesca, who was asking in connection, how can we accompany the current system to its death without somehow feeding the same system or being completely outside it, and how to stand on the edge between the two sides in this transition?
And I think that also relates to the other question about the nation state. So in our research group, we have a distinction between divestment and disinvestment. And divestment means just turning your back and wanting out. Disinvestment means staying with the trouble, right? Staying with the thing that is dying. And hospicing work is not at all. It means a lot of cleaning up, a lot of sitting with, a lot of patience and kindness in the work, in seeing the mess and sitting with it, sitting with your own complicity. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in this area of how do we build ourselves and to have the resilience and stamina to both see death and birth at the same time. We talk about the need to be in the eye of the storm. So the storm being everybody panicking with the birth and the death. And then when you are in the eye of the storm, if you walk too fast, you get caught in the storm. If you walk too slow, you get caught in the storm. So you have to be in it, but in that space of peace and attention, you have to be with the storm, basically. And we've seen the works that have become influential right now for that is, of course, Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble. And also there's a new book called Against Purity. It's by a woman called Shotwell, and she talks about how to think about ethics from a space of complicity. And there is actually on the website, the decolonial website, there's a review of the book. And there's also, of course, Ingrid Hoofd's book that's a little bit older, which is called Ambiguities of Activism. That is also very good. And she's based on Spivak's questions about double binds and the idea of reallocation of desires. So this is a good one for analysis. Shotwell is a very good one for really thinking about like how to be with this, right? And not wanting the exit for innocence. Like I just don't want to be part of all this. And I do have still these moments where I want to go into Slovenia and stay there in the space that we have now we have a space there for educational work that is more related to the land and outside of the constraints of the university. And we have summer programs there, but sometimes I don't want to see this anymore. And that's part of both the move to innocence and the move towards turning your back, the divestment move, are all responses of the same way of being that created the problem, right? So that's one of the difficult parts of staying with the trouble, right? And figuring out how to survive it.
Yeah. I don't know whether that's already, touched on the question with the nation state, or whether.
Yeah, so how do you do that in relation to the nation state? So how to see that as both necessary right now, but without without idealizing it, right? So we tend to think about the nation state as something that protects people, but historically it was actually created to protect property. And the protection of people in terms of rights, civil rights, human rights, have happened when there was a convergence between the interest to protect property and the interest to protect people. When this interest convergence is not there, it then tends to protect property, as we're seeing right now, right? So we still need it right now, and it protects the law right now, that it can go in another way, like what's happening in Brazil, right? Where things are changing very quickly. So we still need it. It can be used both to destroy our freedoms and rights and everything, or to protect it, and there's a fine line there. But if our hope lies only in fixing it or maintaining it, we will have to have a future existence based on private property, right? There is no, or collective property, but property. So we won't be able to transcend the idea that we are separated from the planet, and that we can separate the planet into these different sections. And my work is more like we can do better than that. We can figure out a way that moves beyond this, that provides us another way of being and of life and of coexistence, where these things are no longer no longer necessary, but that no longer makes sense. So yes, it is idealistic.
Well, I mean, so it's again a little bit like Francesca has put it, to stand on the edge between the two, in order to obviously transition it or transform the limitations. Yeah. Well, and I think idealism is, the precondition for everything, actually.
It's a realistic idealism. I think it's possible. It's just that there's a lot of work to be done, right? But in that sense, I do believe that we're much more than what we have become. And because the house exiles certain capacities that we have, and they're if we're thinking about it, we're thinking about it neurobiologically. If we can access these other capacities, we can do much more than what we've been able to do right now. So my hope lies in what is outside of the house and can come in to help us figure it out.
Katharina said she wanted to chip in. Do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah.
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, I'm Katharina, and hello, everyone.
Hi.
Vanessa, first, I want to thank you a lot for the way you presented, especially your straightforward talking, and also the visualizations they used and your positive spirit and warm heart that comes across even through the screen. So yeah, thank you very much for that. And then my question, I don't know, it seems very small to me. And it's actually not about what you presented, but about your paper. Sure. There you had the picture of this olive tree, and I really, really liked it and found it very useful. And I immediately applied it to a workshop that I did on to development cooperation. And I wanted to hear from you whether you feel like the way that because I also changed it, I said, I made it a bit different. So, but I wanted to hear from you whether it makes sense to you how I put some terms in there. So you have the 3 layers of system expansion at the top and system revamp, and then system change at the ontological layer. And I put the alternative development, I put on the epistemological layer of system revamp, and alternatives to development or development cooperation, I put on the system change ontological layer. And I just wanted to hear from you whether that makes sense to you, or because it was actually also a bit. I feel that also, of course, alternative development and alternatives to development are sometimes also a bit similar. Of course, they are also very radically different in some sense, but so I find that a lot of alternatives to also falls under the epistemological layer. That's why I found also the split a bit different, but so.
Yes, I would put it there as well. And I would say to people, like, the thing is that alternatives to development can gesture. Right now, we can only gesture towards something ontologically different. We can't go there yet because we're still very much attached to the tree. But when the critiques address that layer, I would already put them there. So if you address through the critique, the ontological layer, it would be there. But then with the caveat that generally the propositions from the critique, so even in decolonial theory, they critique the roots of the tree and the trunk, but the propositions are still the trunk, right? So if you look at, they gesture outside, but they're still the trunk. I've just written an article with a Maori friend and Cree friend here, indigenous people, saying, when we say, for example, when Mignolo or Maldonado Torres say that we need a different conceptualization of being, you are already back to the same ontology. Because for these indigenous communities, it's not a conceptualization. We don't need another conceptualization. We need another way of being, not grounded on conceptualizations. So it's hard, it's really hard, because when you're writing a paper, everything needs to be a notion. It's a notion of this and a notion of that, because that's the way that you're writing. That's the way you're relating to language. And what my Maori friend says, it says, it's not a notion that we need. Another notion is not going to decolonize anything because it's the same ontology. It's an ontology based on notions. And that was such an interesting insight to say, again, we can only gesture. Our notions are only going to gesture. It's, in order to actually live it, is a very different question. Maybe it's a neurobiological question, right? But the problem is that then when you talk to people using decolonial theory, they think they're already there. And that actually becomes a problem. Because if you're already there, there's no more work to be done, right? It's like Canada saying, we're great with diversity. And then when you show them that actually this is not the case, they don't want to see it, right? So we can do the same. We can be saying, yes, I'm already doing it, when actually you have the critique, which is great, but the doing of it requires much more than just talking about it. The walk, and it's not just about also me wanting to do it. I'm not autonomous to do it. I require whole context to shift with me, and me being able to walk and to breathe in a very different way. It's a hard one, this one, I think, because there's a lot of virtue signaling also in the dopamine thing. Like, I'm a decolonial person. Like, what does it do? It doesn't help with anything. It's, again, vanguardist and teleological, and it's Boxhead all over again. And unfortunately, in academia, I find that more problematic than the neoliberalism, actually. I can work with neoliberalism. With this way of saying things where you have to be in this elevated position and having to say, I have all the answers and we're going there with the people and things like that, is more problematic, I think. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I think maybe also connecting to that, again, the university context. Just recently in a colloquium, I discussed the Sean Wilson indigenous research paradigm, and we were talking about, his emphasis on relationality, with the people around you, obviously with earth, with nature, with and again, there were, as you say, there were people who said, would call themselves, post and decolonial scholars who were saying, this is too, relations and all that. That's not academic, this is not scholarship. That is something, you do in your private time. But it has to have some kind of rationality, even that. So even again, coming from, people working from decolonial perspectives, decolonial lenses, finding it really hard to, take this stance of, relationality and as a center of, or as a point of departure, I would say. But so again, in practice, they're difficult to reconcile, the aspirations and the realities. Yeah.
I can send the paper. It's under review at the moment. It's draft paper. But the distinction that we make in the paper with these other indigenous colleagues is between wording the world and worlding the world. Mm-hmm. So in the worlding is not something we do. We are worlded in the world, but we want to word it for some reason to feel security and to feel that we are at the center of it. And it's a provocative paper, but it deals with some of these issues. It emphasizes a Maori perspective on language, but it shows some of these problems, right? That we may say we're doing it, but saying is saying. And then, yes, we write the papers. Yes, we get our careers supported by these ideas. But what does it actually do in the world is another question. And I'm not saying that writing is not important and doesn't do other things that even we can't imagine. So writing is important, and I'm very grateful for Miolo and Maldonado Torres and all the people who have been writing about it. Even if they say they're saying it and aren't doing it, that's fine. I'm just saying that there is a lot of work in the doing that is difficult, that is painful, and that we might not want to do, even if we say we are interested or we are committed to this cause, right? So it's a hard one.
And there's another hard one from Aftab, whose internet connection is unfortunately not stable enough for him to join us, but he wanted to point out a paradox, because he said, at one level we are talking about, as you pointed out, diversity and about honoring diversity, and yet on the other hand, we're kind of still entangled in finding or in seeking global justice. So something somehow, again, like the homogeneous thing. So he's asking whether global actually means accepting local and indigenous, or is it not just another form of closed-ended thinking in a way that, you know, looks like the other side of the coin, but is really just, you know, again playing a part in this epistemological bubble turning around?
Yeah. we had this discussion actually when we were trying to find, for the earth care thing, we were trying to find a word that could talk about the harm, right? And then how this idea of, we tried well-being, but then well-being is also super fluffy and understood in different ways. So we settled for justice with the caveat that there are many different understandings of justice. The one that we are most familiar with is the concept of liberal justice or distributive justice. And there is also restorative justice. There is Denise Silva proposing transformational justice. We use justice because it was just easier for people to understand. But what we are meaning is a form of metabolic relationality. This justice we're talking about doesn't come from humans. It comes from the whole. It's about us seeing ourselves as part of a wider metabolism that has a collective, is a collective being and a collective intelligence. And it's not about prioritizing this culture or that culture. The culture thing, I think I'm over with, because at this point, a lot of cultural perspectives won the house. And education is just selling tickets to the upper decks of the house. And a lot of people really are buying into it. So I'm not sure, like for the radical reform people, these perspectives are super important. But if you're working more with beyond reform, it's more about like, it's not really about our desires for security. It's about what matters is what matters when I'm no longer in this body. What matters is what is going to happen. And the thing is too that from indigenous perspectives, when you have this metabolic visceral, we don't even have a language. It's a visceral understanding through the metabolism, through the body, right? The question of past, present, and future also collapse. So they have this idea of layer time, where you are me in this body, but you're also me and you in this wider temporality. Then there's me in you in this bigger metabolism, and then there's another temporality that's neither me nor you. It's me and you, us, and then I beyond form and beyond time. So it's justice coming from these other layers, right? Where it's not about talking about I think this, I think that, I want this, I want that. It's about something that is committed to the well-being across layers and beyond form and time. But that's difficult to communicate. And then justice was just easier.
Yeah. Well, I think unfortunately we're already out of time. So I think I'd be happy to share, if you send me the papers or the references you mentioned. I'll be happy to share them to the whole group and to everyone who's interested. And of course, I think it will also be good to rewatch your talk, to be able to digest a little bit more and a little bit in depth, because I think you gave us much food for thought, but also a lot of encouragement, but I think also a lot of things to digest further and to see how we can all, you know, work towards this idealistic realism, activism maybe. So
do you think I should use the talk with my colleagues? It's a draft.
I think so, absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
So thanks very much for your time. Thanks for joining us and giving this really interesting talk. And thanks to everyone who joined and participated. And as I said, we will make it available online on YouTube, also on the EADI website. So by tomorrow you can check and rewatch it. So thanks very much to everyone, and have a nice evening. And Vanessa, have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye
Hope
bye.
to be able to meet again.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye, everyone.